So I've had quite a few requests on how to make skulls from paper mache.
What you want? What you want?
So today we're going to do a tutorial for you guys on how to make a skull, but not from scratch in this video. We'll do a skull from scratch later in another video. This skull is just a real basic, easy thing to do, and it's how to replicate a skull. It can be done using, this is a cheap Walmart plastic skull. You can replicate this in the exact same way I'm going to show you with this one. Here's a little latex skull. Foam-filled latex, you could replicate this if you wanted to. However, for the skull that we're going to have for the tutorial, it is one of these, basically a Bucky skull. They're very well detailed. I like them. This one, you know, was in a bag of bones because it was like mishaps or whatever, but it works great for making a replica. I choose to do mine. I take the jaws off. You can, if you've got one of these, you can leave the jaw on, and you can wrap this whole thing and replicate it that way, and then leave it like this, or you can cut the jaw off later. Most of the things that I do with my skulls, or most of the props I make, I like to have the jaw open, and it gives more of a realistic feel to it. So when I replicate a skull, I pull the jaw off, and I'll replicate this jaw in the same exact fashion as I replicate this. So this is what we started with. And this is what we end up with. A complete, entire, full skull. No hole, no big gaping hole in the bottom. It's not a half skull. We've got the jaw that we can position later. But this will give us a full replica of this skull that you can use any way that you want. The materials you'll need for this project is a skull, aluminum foil, tape, newsprint or phone book print, paper mache paste, an X-Acto knife, and a palette knife. So the first thing we're going to do is wrap this skull with aluminum foil. You're going to press this aluminum foil deep into the eye sockets and the nose sockets and really compress it around that top upper jaw so we gather all that important detail that makes a skull basically a skull. You're going to tape each one of these into place and then just continue going around the skull with aluminum foil until you've completely covered the skull. Now I take tape and I'll go on each line, and where each piece of aluminum foil joins together, I tape that off to make a nice smooth transition. That way I don't get any paper mache paste underneath the aluminum foil. Once you wrap the entire skull, you're going to do the same thing to the jaw itself. Just wrap it up in aluminum foil. Before we add any mache paste, we're going to open up that hole in the bottom of the skull again. This will allow us to put our skull on a stand as we work. We're going to start applying our strip mache to the bottom side of the skull first. Once we get the entire bottom side of this skull with a good couple layers of paper mache or strip mache, we'll then flip the skull over and set it on some type of a stand where that hole is. That way we can access the top side of the skull. So we're going to get all this coverage underneath first, picking up all that detail on the bottom side of the skull. We'll make sure that that's all covered well, that there's no gaps, no aluminum foil showing. Once we've got that part done, we'll just flip this thing over. We're going to put it onto a stand, and then we're going to continue on covering the rest of the skull on the top side and then move it on to the face. One thing I'd like to note real quick, this first step of strip mache on this project is the most frustrating part. The mache doesn't like to stick to the aluminum foil all that well, but it'll slide around on you. It kind of wants to pull up, but if you just have patience and work with it, it will lay down and it will stick. So just stick with it, have patience, it'll come through for you. The next thing I'd like to note on here, when we get around to the face and the eyes or on the nose, use thinner strips of paper. A thinner strip of paper will conform better to the details than a wider strip. So if you're looking for smooth detail lines, make sure you use thinner strips of paper. Now once you got this face all covered in its first layer, then you're going to move on to the jaw, And you're going to cover the jaw in the exact same fashion that we did with the head. You're just going to grab some strip mache and start wrapping it around the jaw. The jaw tends to be a little bit easier because you can wrap all the way around and get the paper to stick to itself. Not quite as frustrating as doing the head itself. Once we got a good layer of strip mache over the skull and the jaw, we'll set this aside for 24 hours, let it dry up completely, and then we'll move on from there to putting on another layer of mache. Now that our pieces have completely dried, we're going to start with our second layer of mache. Now on this second layer, what I'm using here is yellow page print out of a phone book. By using the yellow pages, most of it's got a yellow tint to it, so it's easier for me to keep track of the second layer of mache. That way I can tell I've got a complete coverage all the way around the skull and all the way around the jaw. So if you have the availability to alternate your colors of your paper from like newspaper print to yellow page print and back and forth, if you use that little trick, it'll really help you make sure that you're getting full coverage on your next layers. Now I can't stress this enough, when you're working around the eyes and the nose and these detailed parts, thin strips of paper. The thinner the strip of paper is, the better detail you'll capture out of it. Also, I want to point out on the face, make sure you really layer up some good layers around the eye sockets, around the bridge of the nose, and these cheekbones that go around. Those parts you want to be very strong because they really hold the shape of the skull. So go ahead and take time here, make sure you layer these things up good, that way you've got some good strength to the detail parts of the skull. With any paper mache project you do, the more layers of strip mache you put on at first, the stronger your project's going to be. So if you want to layer this thing 3 or 4 times before you go to cut away, go right ahead. But remember, the more layers you put on right now, the harder it's going to be to cut this back off. Now that our pieces are dry, let's remove this mache from our base skull. First thing we're going to do is trace out some lines, and these lines are going to represent the cut lines that we need to pull these pieces off. So what we're going to do basically is we're going to divide this skull up into 4 different pieces. 2 side pieces on the back quarters of the skull. The entire front face is 1 piece, and then we're going to have a piece underneath that connects from the jaw all the way back to the back side of the head. Now once we get all these pieces traced out, it's always a good thing to label each piece. I'll label the bottom side bottom, and then I'll simply go to the top side and label one piece 1, one piece 2, and one piece 3. This allows me to make sure I get the pieces put back together how they came apart. Now our next step in removing these pieces is to take an X-Acto knife and cut along all these lines that we drew into place. It may take you 4 or 5 passes for each line. You want to be very careful. Don't be too aggressive. If you're too aggressive and you're bearing down too hard, and it's easy, you could slip, cut your hand, cut your finger. You don't want that to happen, so just take your time and go over each piece 2 or 3 times. Using a nice thin bendable palette knife, we're going to begin taking these pieces off. I always start with the back 2 quarter pieces of the skull. You're going to get that palette knife, go down into the edge you've cut, and just get it in between the aluminum foil and the skull itself and work your way through. Now if you come across areas that haven't been cut completely, go ahead and just grab your X-Acto knife, trim those up so you get a cut all the way through, get your piece removed, and then just move on to your next piece. You may find as you go that you've got 3 or 4 places all around the skull that need to be recut. It's fine, just cut them and pull your pieces off. Now these back quarter pieces are the easiest ones to get off. The jaw line or the bottom line here isn't too bad. Just be very careful when you're around those teeth areas so you don't break anything. But right here, the face, this is the most difficult, frustrating part. Take your palette knife, dig it in, and really kind of release it from the skull. And then you're going to have to spend some time here working the skull from top to bottom to get it to release. All these undercuts that are so sharp make this very hard to pull off. But if you have patience and you stay with it, you'll get this face piece to loosen up enough that you'll be able to grab it from one side and pull it completely off. Now once it's all pulled off, remove as much of that aluminum foil as you can from the bottom side of the skull. That way we can connect these pieces back together using some tape. So our next step is just to take these 4 pieces and we're going to put them back together like a big 3D puzzle. Using masking tape on the inside and the outside, we're just going to line up the pieces, join them all back up together, and tape them all into place. Now once the top 3 pieces are all taped into place, we're going to move on and put the bottom side on. Just as easy, just going to lay it in, cap it up, and tape it into place. Once we got all this taped into place, we're going to move on to the jaw and get it removed from the base as well. On the jaw, what we're going to do is cut it into 2 halves, the front half and the back half. So make a line separating the jaw into the 2 halves. You're going to use an X-Acto knife, cut it loose, come back with a palette knife, and remove the 2 pieces. And then simply take those 2 pieces, just like the skull, and tape them back together. Now, if you notice in some pieces like here, you may have a little hole. Don't worry, just put it together using a little bit of tape, smash it in, tape it up, and you're good to go. No one will ever know it was there. Now that we've got this thing all taped together, the next step is we're going to strip mache back over all these cut areas. We're not going to cover the entire skull right now. If we do that, the skull will get a little too weak from being wet, and with these pieces being cut and basically cut, not back together again, it'll move around on you, want to fall apart. So right now, we're just going to strip mache over all the tape and all the pieces that we put back together. Once that step is completely dry, we basically have an entire skull now that is one solid piece. So from this point on, you can put another layer of mache on. You can layer, at this point in time, if you want to put 3 or 4 more layers of mache on, go ahead. The more layers of mache you do, the stronger it's going to be. I just recommend that you layer it 1 layer at a time, let that layer dry, then go back to your next layer and put a new layer on. Once you've got this thing completely layered up and it's completely dried out, you're done. You're finished. You have a base skull to start any new project that you want. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I know this is nothing new. Anyway, now we got our completed skull. From this point on, you can glue the jaw onto the bottom of it. You can really detail these things out. If you just want to put it together, leave it open, and then corpse it, you can do that. You can cut the teeth line out and install other teeth in here to make it more realistic. You can really take this from this base skull, what we got right here, to the zombie, to groundbreaker, to just about anything that you want. But anyway, this video gives you a good basis on how to replicate and make a base skull. With these base skulls, you can do anything. I do like having completely full underneath and the hole here. That way, if I'm going to use this for another prop, I can insert a piece of PVC in here, glue it in, and use that as my attachment structure for the head if I turn this into a head. So that's pretty much it, guys, in a nutshell. Later on, I'll do another tutorial basically taking one of these and going further into detail with it, where we'll cut the teeth line out, we'll add in our own teeth, top and bottom, we'll put the skull on, maybe we'll corpse it, maybe we'll make it look like a zombie. Anyway, I'll just take one of these and show you what you can do with one of these and the kind of detail, or the more detailed you can make one of these skulls to become another item for one of your props for Halloween. Anyway, thanks a lot, and I hope you guys maybe learned something today.